Hello, and welcome to Nosotros, the podcast about Mexican-American history, politics, cultura, y más, brought to you in part by the Gomez Law Firm. I'm your host, Elaine Ayala, Metro columnist for the San Antonio Express News. My guest today is J.B. Sauceda, the new host of the long-running TV series Texas Hill Country Reporter and the new podcast Viva Tejano. Welcome to San Antonio, JB.
Happy to be here. I love visiting as much as I can.
Before we get started, we like to play a little game of rapid fire questions, although they're often not rapid fire because the guests refuse. But it's called This or That. And so let's start.
Sure.
Urban Tejanos or rural Tejanos?
I'll go rural. Yeah.
Because of?
I just like being out in the country. I've always been a bit more rancho in terms of just like my preferences. So yeah, I'll go
rancho.
Yeah.
That is so good.
Yeah.
Rancho, where you can find somebody cooking with an underground oven.
Yeah.
It's barbacoa.
I'm actually doing a story on a restaurant that does that here pretty soon.
They do a pozo in the ground? Oh, how fabulous. Where is it?
You'll have to watch.
Oh, okay.
You'll have to watch in the spring.
Okay, all righty. Dick Clark or Johnny Canales?
Ooh, that's hard.
Both very influential.
Both influential and different roles. I'll pick Johnny Canales because I feel like I've got a more direct personal connection, but I say that, and Dick Clark's New Year's Eve was,
you grew up with that.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I'll go Johnny Canales.
Yeah.
So.
We'll talk more about him.
Yeah.
Little Joe y la Familia or La Mafia?
I think I'll go Little Joe. Las Nubes is one of my dad's favorite songs and one of mine. So
it's an anthem for Chicanos.
Yeah. So I'm going to go Little Joe.
Yeah. He's been on the show and was just wonderful. Okay. Selena y los Dinos in cow print outfits or Freddie Fender's hair? It's kind of a style question.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go the cow print outfits because that was pretty bold. It was...
and unashamed.
Yeah.
They just owned it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that after that, I saw like cow print out in public. Mm-hmm. Like people embraced it. Mm-hmm. They say, I'm not ashamed of cows. Mm-hmm. I'm going to wear these pants. Mm-hmm. It was great.
No, it was a pretty bold move.
All right. More accordion or more synthesizers?
I prefer accordion, but I kind of gravitate more towards conjunto and norteño.
Yes, me too.
Orquesta is great. Like I love that too, but I'm more of an accordion person.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right. This was a controversial one, so be careful.
Mm-hmm. Austin breakfast tacos
or San Antonio breakfast tacos?
I'm a firm believer that whatever breakfast taco is accessible is the best. So
the one before you?
Yeah. So I'm in San Antonio right now. It's probably San Antonio.
Okay,
but
all right.
If I'm rolling out of bed on Saturday morning, it's hard to compete with a breakfast taco that's 10 minutes away.
Yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you my breakfast taco story. That when I was in Austin last, somebody was serving up like breakfast tacos with eggplant. And I just said, this is where we part ways.
I've literally never heard of that. That's wild. Yeah.
Okay. So, you're the new host, Texas Country Reporter, of long
52 years. Yeah.
That's
so we're in
crazy.
season 53 right now.
So, I want you to talk about two things: your upbringing, where you're from, and what prepared you for this. And then get into the gentleman who used to, host that show, his iconic voice, his old-timey voice, really, and what you're going to bring. What have you brought to this new position?
I'm a genuinely curious person, and I think that's what the role really just warrants. It's, the state changes and stays the same at the same time. I mean, there are institutions and organizations in places that are very much still the way that they are and or have been for a long time. And it's really great to be able to cover those and kind of get to go back and rehash and retell some stories while also being in a position to go explore some new corners of the state that the show might not have, covered in the past. And so in my case, like I have a lot of deep connections to South Texas. I have a lot of family down there, and the show's been all over. I mean, one of the most impressive things about Bob is, Bob Phillips, the former host, is that
I can hear his voice. He had
an incredible voice, and I think that just the sheer reach and distance that they traveled over those 50 years is incredible. But when I talked to him, he basically just said, like, the only advice I can give you is to just make sure the show is still always about the subject. And that's the one thing that we've really, there have been other things we thought, let's change the way we shoot this, or let's update that. But for us, probably the most important tried and true practice has been that it's not about me. It's about the subjects of the show.
He always found the most interesting little niches, little places that do things their own way. I remember he did a story. We had done it too, but he put a new spin on it. And it was a man somewhere in San Antonio. He's probably long gone. And he had a toilet seat collection that spanned a huge kind of warehouse.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. The show was just incredible at surfacing that sort of story. And we still take a lot of pride in that sort of thing. I mean, it's amazing the types of story suggestions that we get on Instagram or Twitter, or, wherever. Like, a lot of people reach out and suggest stuff. And the story isn't always obvious on the surface, but that curiosity that I and the other producers have, I think, is what really drives us to being able to dig in. And, the toilet seat is just sort of the vehicle for some other lesson that we can pull out of people. And I think that's what's so great.
Wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. There are a lot of travel shows, I mean, there are a million places that you can go learn about where to go and what to eat. And that's great. I love that. I used to be on a show that was very much like that, actually based here in San Antonio, called YOLO, Texas. And
I remember that.
Yeah, so I was one of the hosts on that show, and that was really fun. It was awesome to go bounce around and show people the great things to do around the state. But the opportunity that we have with Texas Country Reporter is that it is far more focused on, like, what are the stories behind the people that make the state so great. And so you get a little bit of both. We always have a segment that is kind of featuring, where to go and what to see or what to do and eat. But during that process, we make a point to try to understand the people who made that place so great, or, that food so incredible. And yeah, so my hope is that it's a little bit of a, cup of coffee and a cup of optimism to kick things off for,
that's a
for
great
your
way
week.
to say.
Yeah.
You've only been the host of that for this season, right?
Yeah, I got the job. So I was notified that I got the job last September, but I started recording and doing, producing the new season only this year. So we started in February, and then it started airing in September. So we're only a handful of months in. Yeah.
Well, okay. So far, tell us some of the stories that you've told.
Yeah, I think one of my favorites is a story that we shot outside of west of San Antonio in Junction, and it was about a gentleman who is a farmer, but not of like the traditional things you would think to farm. He farms native grasses and plants, and so he figured out that we're having some challenges with water, and we're using way more water in most cities on grass than we are on for the purposes of drinking. And when he started to dig into it, he realized that it's largely because the grasses and things that we plant in our yard are not from here. They're, grasses from the Caribbean or from South America or whatever. And
the Midwest, which has a whole different,
different climate.
Yeah. And you have to water them a lot.
Right. And that's his point, is that, these things need a lot of water and fertilizer to coddle them to survive in a climate that they were never really designed to survive in. And so his efforts, and really the lesson was, I asked him, I was like, why do you do this? This is not an easy task. And his stance was pretty simple. He said, I want to be a great ancestor. And I feel like if I don't make a change, then I'm complicit in passing down a Texas that is less hospitable and less comfortable for people to live in. And he doesn't wag his finger at people. He doesn't try to make you feel bad for, the way or decisions that you've made in your own home or your own yard. He's simply pointing out that, there's actually something really tactically beautiful about what he does, and that those grasses also don't have to be mowed very often. So he said, you spend all this money planting this grass, pouring water on it, pouring fertilizer on it to keep it alive, and then you pay someone else to come in and cut it every week to keep it to a particular length. He's like, I've got grasses that are native that you cut once a year, and they will survive and thrive with basically no water.
Okay, we need that guy on the show.
Yeah, so that story, I think, cuts to what is so great about TCR, because it's a little bit of kind of what I call solutions, journalism, where we're not just looking for the things that are wrong, we're looking for the things that are wrong and or a challenge, and people who are taking on those challenges and trying to do something about them. So it's been really fun to see the sorts of stories and things that people surface, because there's a lot of good out in the world if you look for it. And I think that these days a lot of people look to most media organizations as really just sources of things that are wrong and complaints and why and hatred or division. And I don't think that that's an unfair assessment a lot of times. And so our goal is to be the stewards of optimism and promote where we think there are really great people doing great things all over the state.
What's been the reception so far, especially given that, well, you're Mexican American, they identify as Tejano, and the former longtime host was not. It certainly looks from the outside like a whole new perspective. But what's been the reception, and how do you see your role?
I didn't really go into it with that in mind. I don't necessarily walk around with it as like a badge of like, hey guys, there's a changing of guard because my last name's Sauceda. I grew up in Texas. I love the culture here, and the culture is for everybody. I had an experience that was unique to where I lived, but people that lived down the street from me had a different experience because of where they lived on the street. So my goal is to simply just bring the thousands of lenses that I see the world through. In addition to being a Tejano, I'm a male. I'm from Southeast Houston. I'm a pilot. I'm a photographer. I'm an entrepreneur. I mean, I'm a UT fan. I like the Astros. Like, there's 1,000 lenses that I can use to basically tell a story through. And so I think that the thing that I've tried to communicate to people, because I've had people come up to me and say, "Oh, it's awesome that we have a Tejano, host." And I'm really happy that that's like something people see and they go, "Oh, I feel seen."
I felt like that.
Yeah. And I think that's awesome. But I think the reason I say I don't, lean on that or wear it is because I want people to feel that way about all of the things that we cover. It really is not about me. It's really about like, do you feel like there's something A that represents you on the show, and B that there's something that doesn't represent you that you're learning about. And that's really my goal. It's to and I think that's really no different than what the show's always done. The tactical differences between me and Bob are that again, I'm a pilot, so there'll probably be some flying stories. I am Tejano, and so I have a lot of family in the Rio Grande Valley. So from picking up the phone and surfacing stories, I got a lot more people down there that I can probably call and hear from. And then there's the stuff like I'm in Central Texas, so I can get to a lot more of the state more easily in a day trip. Yeah.
Do you fly to some of those places you've gone to, or are you driving?
So far, I haven't, but only in because the way that we've shot this season has not really made it make sense yet. Mm-hmm. But we are looking in season 54 to do that because, season 54. Yeah. So we're currently.
How old is Bob?
I think he's about 73, something like that. He started doing the show when he was 19.
Oh my God. I had no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to the previous question about just like identity and stuff. I mean, I think, for me, the state, it's very easy for the entirety of the state to see a lot of TV and movie and, media production kind of being isolated to the triangle of Texas and really just everything between Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston. And that's what's really important to me. And so like, I'm not intentionally or not going to go purposely tilt the scales for any particular group. Mm-hmm. But I am going to make a huge effort to make sure that every corner of the state is covered pretty regularly. And so being in Central Texas helps that in a big way. The show has historically been produced out of Dallas. So they always made the effort. I mean, I never have a problem getting the crew to go anywhere. But it is dramatically different, and you have to plan a lot more if you're going to drive 8 hours to go somewhere versus if it's a quick little 3-hour trip. For the podcast that I do, I made a day trip to go interview Bobby Pulido, and I drove to the Rio Grande Valley and back in one day, and that didn't bother me. So it's been fun.
You mentioned some things and which you identify like a pilot, like lover of music. But tell us a little bit about your background and how Tejano music was part of that.
Yeah, I grew up in a very Tejano household, Southeast Houston. My parents, my dad's family, they were migrant workers and they would travel up and down I-35. And so he had a lot of connections and roots up in the Chicago area where there are a lot of, Chicanos and Tejanos. And so he traveled up there quite a bit, went to high school there. My mom's family also spent a fair amount of time up there in the Midwest. And but ultimately they settled Southeast Houston and just kind of chose that as home for them. My family, my extended family is mostly in the Valley or south of San Antonio. On my mom's side, it's it was a lot of family in Carrizo and like, Crystal City in that area. And then my dad's was all of San Benito and close to Brownsville. So
the birthplace of Freddie Fender.
The birthplace of Freddie Fender. And so we spent a lot of time down there, and the Tejano music was just always on in the background, and not just on those vacations. It was on the weekend at home in Houston too. And, and I think back when I was a kid, especially basically like mid 80s to the mid 90s, it was just pervasive. I mean, it was on the radio everywhere. There was always like a concert going on. There was a big club there in town called El Dorado Ranch that was really popular. My parents knew the owners. And I mean, it was sort of this really interesting period for Tejano and for me, and I grew up around it constantly. And so it was it was woven into our family's experience in a big way.
For some people like you, it was Tejano, and for some people like me in my generation, it was all the Mexican classics, the Javier Solis, the Vicky Cars. All of those were in my Tejano kind of came later for me, but they're both incredible soundtracks to a childhood. Okay, I want to talk about your podcast, but before that, I want to talk about Johnny Canales and how he either influenced you or how he plays into what you're doing on your podcast, which is Viva Tejano. And I want to tell you that one of the this or that's that I failed to ask was, take it away or you got it.
You have to have both. I mean, there's really no choosing between either. He was incredible. And I think I've talked a lot on the show. So the premise of the show is that we use the Johnny Canales show to go explore Tejano music and like what happened to it. It's a music that, you know, as I mentioned, was everywhere. And in San Antonio, this came up that, you know, KXTN was the #1 station in broad market. It wasn't just in Tejano or Latin music. It was period. It was the largest radio station in San Antonio. Now I think it's, you know, AM only or something like that, right? And and there's Tejano, but we
have another station too, but it's changed completely.
Yeah, and so, you know, I grew up with it. I'm, you know, a 7, 8, 9-year-old listening to this music my parents listened to. Every Sunday morning we'd watch Johnny Canales. It was this thing that kind of just part of the family life. And, you know, I grew up as you know, the joke is the no sabo kid, right? Like my parents did not feel the need to teach us Spanish.
Oh, that no sabo has been around for several generations. Yeah.
But I do think though that there was this, I mean, I've met a lot of people and I'm sure this has been true for a long time, but, you know, in talking to my parents, and my dad in particular, I mean, he shared a lot of sort of not profiling, but just the treatment that he had growing up in school by English only speaking teachers who just looked down their nose at people who spoke Spanish. And so I think that really had a lasting impression on him and my mom. And, you know, it was really no major decision on their part, but they were just like, we live in Houston, our kids should just learn English. Like that's the thing. And so, you know, in talking to my dad, it's not like you would talk to him and think, oh, he only knows Spanish. I mean, he sounds like everybody else, but he speaks really great Spanish, but it just was a decision that him and my mom made not to teach us. And so, but that didn't mean that they didn't still play the music and all of that. And so the part of the reason that I liked Johnny Canales so much was because unlike most of the other, you know, Sábado Gigante or any of these other shows that would be on one of the Spanish stations, you knew what Johnny was talking about because he would bounce back and forth between English and Spanish. And so that was, I think, in a lot of ways, he was like the antithesis of the concept of gatekeeping. Like his whole thing was, I'm going to put all of these different types of music together on one show. And so I found as I grew older and got involved with, you know, these different organizations like the Tejano Music Coalition and these, you know, stuff as a teenager and early 20-something-year-old, that there was significantly more line in the sand drawing around what wasn't Tejano music than what I perceived. I had a playlist that I was creating in that era as I was getting older and, you know, starting to kind of explore my childhood. I'd go back and, you know, with the advent of iTunes, could go find music that I hadn't heard in a long time. And I was seeking out a lot of Tejano. But what I kind of found was that as I was putting this playlist that I defined as Tejano together, there was music that people did not think was Tejano and were very clear about their perception that or definition that what was and wasn't. And so that's always resonated with me and kind of stuck with me because I always felt like that was a unique thing about Johnny. And so fast forward, it's been now at this point 20 years since those experiences of putting these playlists together, and I play Tejano for my kids, and my wife likes it, and so I'm working at Texas Monthly on this Texas Country Reporter, and I found out that the organization was helping support a documentary about Johnny Canales, and there was some discussion about helping support and promote it. And you know, I was asked, is there a desire to maybe do a podcast on Johnny? And so I said, yeah, let's dig into it. And as I kind of went down that road with the producers, ultimately what we kind of discovered was that there was an opportunity to go explore this concept of what happened at Tejano. And, you know, initially it was where did it go? Did it die? The answer is no. It's still very much around.
Oh, big time.
But the infrastructure is just not there in the way that it was back in the 90s. And so, but through this discussion, I've brought in a litany of different people, a mixture of musicians like Bobby Pulido and Max Baca, to, Congressman Joaquin Castro, who grew up in San Antonio and just has opinions about the music and about his experience with it. And so it's been a really fun show. Johnny, as he was back in the 90s in his heyday, is the vehicle for bringing people together. And so he's the reason that we're convening to have these conversations. I typically play a clip from the show because we have a bunch of access to.
I was going to ask how you got access.
Yeah, his family, his wife and kids gave access to the magazine and to the producers of the documentary. And so I typically play a segment for whoever is on the show, and then we just go where the conversation goes. And so some of the discussions are firmly rooted in Tejano music and what it is and isn't. And in other instances, it's the food or the politics or whatever else we may kind of discover. But it's been an interesting discussion, and I've been describing it as kind of entering the danger zone because we're talking about something people feel really passionate about and have strong opinions about as well.
Oh, definitely. And I'll tell you a little story about meeting Johnny. I was at the Austin American Statesman, a feature writer. We could kind of suggest stories from anywhere. So I suggested visiting with Johnny, and he was thrilled. His brother was around at the time, who was his sidekick. I forget his name. But so he says, well, he was gonna produce a show somewhere like in Harlingen, in a nightclub. It was fabulous. And so I drove to Corpus, and from Corpus we drove to Harlingen and stopped everywhere. He had friends everywhere, every convenience store, and gas station. And the Texas Tornadoes were headlining the show that day. It was right when Hey Baby Que Pasó was big, was starting to get bigger. And on Johnny's show, everything is lip syncing, because they didn't have the facilities for a live show most of the time. I don't know if you found that differently, and all the guys had not been to bed from the night before. It was fabulous. And Johnny was fabulous. And the people really, not a cult following, but just a very strong base of support. Did you ever get to meet him and interview him?
No, he passed away before I had the opportunity. One of the things I did feel really honored to get to do was that I wrote his obituary for Texas Monthly. And, we were aware that he was not doing well. And, through the relationship with the documentary, we were in fairly close contact with his family. And so we'd been sort of tipped off, by them that he was not well. And so we got ahead of it and worked on that and wanted to honor him in a way that was respectful of his legacy. And for both people who, I wanted, cognizant that Dick Clark is a universal household name. I knew that Johnny was for Tejanos, but not necessarily for anybody else. And so I wanted it to serve the purpose of both sort of being background on him and giving context for who he was to people who didn't know and might be shocked at the outpouring of support in the event that he passed, while also just sort of scratching that nostalgic itch for everybody else that may have not thought about him in a while. And so, so I ended up writing our culture editor, Aaron, Parsley reached out and asked if I was willing to do it. And he had the great idea to make it something that was more of just an introspection and reflection on my personal relationship with the show. And so I just went to the nostalgia and talked and described what Sunday mornings were like and why it mattered. And it was really incredible to see the feedback that we got from people. And Owen, who's on our video team, reached out and was like, hey, let's turn this into a video. And so he recorded me answering some questions. And for like a week or two after he passed, when we uploaded all of it, it was really incredible to see the number of people that just shared how important he was to them. And I feel the same way, and I think that, again, I think the thing that was so great about Johnny was that he was not a gatekeeper. He brought people in who were norteño musicians. He brought in conjunto. For him, it was, if it's good, it's on the air. That's the premise,
That's right.
you know? And he didn't care whether you were a big name or small name. And that's also, I think, really incredible. And so, you know, you asked about his influence on me. And I think that one of the things I've always been most proud of as a Tejano is this kind of like, it doesn't really matter where you come from, background. You can show up with a 6-pack and like you can sit in the garage with all of us, sort of deal. And that I think is very much in the spirit of how he operated, and is very much the, you know, an influence that I've carried on, you know, into the show, and is something that one of our core values of the TV show is it takes all kinds. Mm-hmm. And it takes all kinds to produce the show. We have very different people, you know, all across the production team. It takes all kinds to surface great ideas, and those great ideas typically are made up of all kinds of different people and stories, you know. And so in a lot of ways, you know, I do think that that's something that I certainly learned from watching that show.
Johnny was such an influential person in the lives of Mexican Americans, mm-hmm. all the way to the north, to the Midwest, to the north.
Oh, it was broadcast internationally.
Yeah.
I mean, millions of people a week.
And I remember running into people like from Chicago mm-hmm. At the taping, because they were coming home to visit and they got tickets and they showed up at the taping. It was a big thrill for them. So I think Johnny would just be thrilled mm-hmm. that a young man like you is promoting his contribution to Mexican American life. Mm-hmm. And politics. He was a political person, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And music. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely, I'm really proud of what we're getting to do, and really excited about the types of stories that we're getting to tell, and just couldn't be more appreciative of the opportunity to tell people about it.
Well, here's the thing: is that you're young. You could be on for a long time.
Now, I will say, Bob was a lot younger than me. I turned 40 in March, and so.
Oh, you look way younger.
Yeah, so if I'm on as long as him, I'll be in my 90s.
No,
you know,
okay,
so
well, maybe not that long.
Yeah.
But,
so I mean, I hope to do it as long as I can. Is the best way to say it. I would love to, but yeah, I had a very full career before I started this, and so he jumped right in at the very beginning and stuck with it, which is incredible. So,
yes, his legacy is firmly in Texas.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. You can watch video versions of Nosotros on YouTube and listen to it anywhere you get your podcasts. My Metro column appears Wednesdays and Fridays in the San Antonio Express News. And if you want to reach me, my email address is eayala@express-news.net. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time on Nosotros.